The railway foreman struck bedrock on August 14, 1883, 2 miles east of the Kentucky-Tennessee border. When the pickaxe broke through the compacted earth that morning, it exposed skeletal remains measuring over 7 feet in length. What they found beneath that hill would challenge everything documented about who inhabited these mountains. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad had purchased the corridor through a land grant arrangement that required minimal surveying. The terrain in this section of the Cumberland Gap had been considered too remote for settlement, too steep for agriculture, and too far from existing communities to warrant detailed geological assessment. Maps from the 1850s showed the area as largely unexplored territory, marked only with approximate elevation measurements and the notation, difficult passage. Local Cherokee families avoided the region entirely, though they offered no explanation to the railway company representatives who inquired about potential obstacles to construction. Silas Drummond had supervised excavation projects throughout Tennessee and southern Kentucky for nearly 2 decades. He understood soil composition, drainage patterns, and the challenges of mountain terrain. When his lead excavator, a German immigrant named Heinrich Vogel, called him to examine the exposed section that August morning, Drummond assumed they had encountered a natural cave formation, or perhaps an old mining shaft from an earlier, undocumented settlement attempt. What lay beneath the disturbed earth was neither. The cavity measured approximately 12 feet in length and 6 feet across at its widest point. Vogel had cleared enough debris to reveal a deliberate arrangement of stones forming a crude chamber. The construction showed no mortar or binding material, just carefully fitted rocks, creating a sealed space beneath several feet of accumulated soil and root systems. The positioning suggested intentional burial rather than natural geological formation. Drummond ordered his crew to expand the excavation carefully, treating the site as they would any unexpected find that might delay construction or require documentation for the company's legal protection. By mid-afternoon, they had exposed the full extent of the chamber. Inside, partially covered by centuries of mineral deposits and organic decay, lay skeletal remains of extraordinary proportions. The skull alone measured larger than any Drummond had encountered in previous excavations, where accidental grave disturbances had occurred. The long bones, still partially articulated despite the passage of time, suggested a person who would have stood well over 7 feet in height. The bone density appeared unusual even to Drummond's untrained eye, heavier and thicker than normal human skeletal structure. Drummond sent a rider to the nearest town, a coal mining settlement called Pineville, approximately 18 miles southwest. His instructions specified the need for a physician or anyone with medical training who could examine the remains and provide documentation. The railway company required detailed reports on any discoveries that might generate legal complications or delays. He also requested that local authorities be notified, though he doubted the county sheriff would travel such a distance for what appeared to be a very old burial site with no obvious criminal implications. Dr. Nathaniel Ashford arrived 2 days later, having traveled from Pineville with a deputy sheriff who seemed more interested in the railway construction than the excavated remains. Ashford had practiced medicine in the region for 30 years, having relocated from Philadelphia after the war. He had examined numerous skeletal remains during his career, including those from battlefield recoveries and accidental exhumations during agricultural work. What he documented in his initial assessment that afternoon would eventually reach medical institutions and archaeological societies across the eastern United States. The measurements Ashford recorded showed a skeleton of remarkable size and unusual proportion. The individual would have stood between 7 feet 4 inches and 7 feet 8 inches in life, with bone structure suggesting exceptional physical strength. The skull displayed features Ashford could not easily categorize, showing characteristics that seemed inconsistent with the regional population's documented physical traits. He noted these observations in his field journal with careful precision, aware that his findings would likely face skepticism from colleagues who had not examined the remains directly. As the sun set behind the ridgeline that evening, Drummond's crew covered the excavation site and posted guards. Ashford remained at the camp, writing detailed notes by lamplight and sketching the skeletal arrangement from multiple angles. Neither man realized they had uncovered the first of many such burials, or that this discovery would open questions about Appalachian history that would remain unanswered for generations to come. Word of the discovery spread through academic circles with unexpected speed. By late September of 1883, 3 separate university expeditions had converged on the railway excavation site. Professor Edmund Thornley from Yale brought surveying equipment and a team of graduate students. Dr. Ephraim Blackburn traveled from the Smithsonian Institution with authorization to document and potentially transport significant finds to Washington. A smaller group from the University of Virginia arrived with geological instruments and photography equipment determined to establish whether the burial represented an isolated anomaly or part of a larger pattern. The railway company grudgingly granted access to the site, though construction delays cost them nearly $2,000 per week. Silas Drummond remained on location, coordinating between the academic teams and company officials, who wanted the matter resolved quickly. The excavation expanded methodically over the following weeks, revealing a complexity that nobody had anticipated. What they had initially assumed to be a single burial chamber proved to be the entrance to an extensive mound structure covering nearly 3 acres of previously undisturbed highland terrain. Thornley's team mapped the site with precision, documenting 17 distinct burial chambers arranged in 3 concentric rings around a central location. The outer ring contained 12 chambers, each housing skeletal remains similar in size and proportion to the first discovery. The middle ring held 4 burials, positioned at cardinal compass points, while the innermost ring contained a single massive chamber that appeared to hold multiple individuals, whose remains had become intermingled over the centuries. Each skeleton measured between 7 feet and 7 feet 10 inches in length. Blackburn conducted detailed cranial measurements across multiple specimens, finding consistent characteristics that distinguished these individuals from any documented population in North America. The skulls showed pronounced brow ridges, unusually large eye sockets, and jaw structures suggesting powerful bite force. Bone density measurements exceeded normal human ranges by significant margins. The femurs alone weighed nearly twice what Blackburn would have expected for their length, suggesting either exceptional muscle mass during life or fundamental differences in skeletal composition. The positioning of the remains suggested deliberate ritual burial practices. Bodies had been placed in extended positions, facing eastward, with arms crossed over the chest cavity. Several burials included grave goods, though these items showed severe degradation from centuries of soil exposure. Fragments of what appeared to be worked metal lay scattered in 3 chambers, too corroded for accurate identification. Stone tools found in other burials showed sophisticated craftsmanship, particularly a series of blades with handles clearly designed for much larger hands than normal human proportions would require. Dr. Blackburn attempted to engage local Cherokee families in discussions about the site's historical context. The nearest settlement, a small community called Wolf Creek, approximately 9 miles northeast, housed several families with deep generational ties to the region. Blackburn visited twice during October of 1883, accompanied by a translator familiar with Cherokee language and customs. The conversations proved frustrating and ultimately fruitless. Elders acknowledged awareness of the location but refused to discuss its significance. One elder, a man named Standing Bear, who appeared to be in his 70s, stated simply that the place belonged to those who came before, and that disturbing it would bring consequences the white men did not understand. When Blackburn pressed for clarification about who these people had been, Standing Bear's response offered no comfort. He described them only as the old ones, who lived in the high places, who took what they wanted from the valleys below, and who vanished when the earth turned against them. He refused to elaborate despite Blackburn's continued questions, finally walking away from the conversation entirely when the doctor suggested that surely these were simply unusually tall ancestors of the current Cherokee population. The academic teams departed by mid-November as winter weather made the mountain location increasingly inhospitable. They transported selected skeletal specimens, photographed extensively, and left detailed maps of the burial complex. Railway construction resumed in early December. By March of 1884, the mound had been leveled, the bones reinterred in a single mass grave 3 miles from the original location, and the tracks completed on schedule. The official railway company records made no mention of the delay or its cause. Blackburn published preliminary findings in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in June of 1884, describing a population of exceptional stature inhabiting the Cumberland Gap region at an indeterminate date, prior to documented Cherokee settlement. The article generated immediate controversy. Critics questioned the measurements, suggested exaggeration or misidentification, and demanded access to the physical specimens for independent verification. That access would never be granted. The Smithsonian specimens disappeared from institutional storage sometime between 1887 and 1891. Dr. Blackburn's careful documentation remained, but the physical evidence he had transported to Washington vanished without explanation. Transfer records showed the bones moved between facilities 3 times during that period, each relocation noted with standard administrative language about space constraints and collection reorganization. The final entry, dated March of 1891, indicated placement in a secure storage area that subsequent archivists could never locate. What survived were Blackburn's notes and a growing collection of historical accounts that suggested the railway burial mound represented far more than an isolated discovery. Father Augustine Mercier, a Jesuit missionary who had worked among Cherokee and Shawnee communities between 1792 and 1814, left detailed journals now housed at Georgetown University. His writings described oral traditions consistent across multiple tribal groups, all referencing a previous population of exceptional height and pale complexion, who had inhabited the highest mountain valleys before Cherokee memory began. Mercier recorded these accounts with scholarly precision, noting dates, locations, and the names of his informants. A Shawnee elder named Red Hawk, interviewed near present-day Lexington in 1798, described the ancient ones as standing tall as 2 men, with skin like winter snow and eyes that reflected firelight like animal eyes. They lived in stone houses carved into cliff faces, cultivated crops on narrow mountain terraces, and descended to the valleys only to hunt and take livestock from the settlements below. Red Hawk claimed his grandfather's grandfather had seen one of these beings from a distance during a hunting expedition, watching from a ridgeline before disappearing into the high country. Cherokee accounts documented by Mercier between 1803 and 1811 offered similar descriptions with disturbing consistency. Multiple informants from separate communities, with no apparent contact with one another, described the same physical characteristics and behavioral patterns. The beings lived apart from other populations, maintained fortified positions in elevated terrain, and possessed strength that made them dangerous adversaries in the rare conflicts that occurred. One account from a woman named Cornflower, recorded in 1808 near the Hiwassee River, described an incident from her childhood where her village lost 3 hunters who ventured too far into the forbidden high country. Their bodies were found weeks later, arranged in a clearing as a warning. The most detailed account came from a Cherokee physician named Whitepath, whom Mercier interviewed extensively during the winter of 1813. Whitepath claimed his people's oral history divided into distinct periods, with the time before the Pale Giants vanished considered a separate era from current memory. He described the giants as builders of stone fortifications, still visible throughout the mountains, though most had been reclaimed by forest growth. They grew different crops than the Cherokee, hunted different game, and spoke a language that no living person understood. Their disappearance happened gradually, according to the stories Whitepath had learned from his elders. First, they retreated deeper into the mountains, then their numbers dwindled, until finally only abandoned structures remained, as evidence they had existed at all. Mercier's journals languished in Georgetown's archives for nearly 8 decades before a doctoral student named Margaret Sinclair discovered them in 1896 while researching frontier religious missions. She recognized the potential significance immediately, particularly given the recent Cumberland Gap discoveries. Sinclair spent 2 years cross-referencing Mercier's accounts with other historical sources, finding corroborating evidence in settlers' journals, frontier military reports, and even occasional newspaper accounts from the early 1800s. A Virginia militia report from 1807, located in state archives, described an expedition into the Cumberland Mountains to investigate reports of hostile activity. The commanding officer, Captain Jonas Whitfield, noted discovering stone fortifications of unknown origin at extreme elevations, far beyond any documented settlement activity. His description of the construction matched details in Cherokee accounts collected by Mercier, suggesting sophisticated defensive positions designed for occupation by a substantial population. Sinclair published her findings in 1901, arguing that multiple independent sources demonstrated a distinct pre-Cherokee population in the Appalachian highlands. The academic response ranged from polite skepticism to outright dismissal. Without physical evidence to examine, most scholars treated the accounts as mythological rather than historical, regardless of their consistency across sources and cultures. The stone walls existed exactly where the historical accounts claimed they would. Between 1903 and 1907, geological survey teams conducting mineral assessments throughout eastern Kentucky and western Virginia documented extensive stone fortifications at elevations exceeding 3,000 feet. The structures appeared on official survey maps, with notation indicating unknown origin and uncertain age. Most showed significant deterioration from centuries of weather exposure and vegetation encroachment, but their deliberate construction remained unmistakable. Survey engineer Harold Pittman led expeditions into the most remote sections of the Cumberland Range during the summer of 1905. His team discovered a complex of walls and earthworks spanning nearly 8 miles of ridgeline terrain, positioned to command views of 3 separate valleys below. The walls stood between 4 and 7 feet tall, where they remained intact, constructed from limestone blocks, weighing several hundred pounds each. No mortar bound the stones together, yet the fitting showed precision that required considerable engineering knowledge. Gaps in the walls occurred at regular intervals, suggesting planned entrances or defensive positions rather than simple decay. Pittman's most significant finding emerged from careful examination of the construction techniques. The blocks showed tool marks inconsistent with Cherokee or Shawnee, implements documented in archaeological records. The cutting patterns suggested metal tools of substantial size, used with force that required exceptional physical strength. Several stones bore marks where they had been split along natural fracture lines, then shaped to fit specific positions in the wall structure. The labor involved in transporting these blocks to such extreme elevations would have demanded either large work crews or individuals of unusual physical capacity. Earthworks accompanied the stone fortifications in several locations. These consisted of raised platforms behind the walls, creating elevated positions for defenders to observe approaches from below. The platforms showed evidence of wooden structures at some point in the past, though only soil discoloration and occasional post holes remained. Pittman estimated the fortifications could have housed a population of several hundred individuals if occupied continuously, or served as seasonal defensive positions for a larger group dispersed across multiple sites. Dating the structures proved impossible with available methods. No organic material survived in sufficient condition for analysis. The weathering patterns suggested extreme age, certainly predating European contact, and likely predating documented Cherokee settlement of the region. Pittman noted in his field reports that local Cherokee families continued to avoid the fortification sites, refusing to accompany survey teams into those areas despite offers of payment for guide services. A second survey team, working independently in Western Virginia during 1906, made discoveries that corroborated Pittman's findings. Led by cartographer Ezra Calhoun, this expedition documented similar fortifications along a ridgeline system approximately 40 miles northeast of Pittman's primary site. The Virginia structures showed identical construction methods and strategic positioning, suggesting a coordinated defensive network rather than isolated outposts. Calhoun's team found evidence of quarrying operations at lower elevations, where limestone had been extracted and presumably transported uphill for wall construction. The volume of stone involved suggested decades of sustained effort. Most disturbing were the sight lines. Someone standing atop these fortifications during daylight hours could observe movement across vast stretches of valley floor. Smoke from cooking fires, approaching travelers, even livestock movements would have been visible from these positions. The valleys below contained prime hunting grounds and river access, yet the fortification builders had chosen to occupy the barren, exposed ridgelines instead. The defensive advantage was obvious, but the choice implied a population that feared attack or preferred isolation from those living at lower elevations. Military historians who reviewed the survey reports noted the sophistication of the defensive positioning. These were not simple shelters or temporary camps. They represented sustained occupation by a group that understood tactical advantages, invested enormous labor in fortification construction, and maintained control of strategic highland terrain for an extended period. Yet no written records documented their existence, and no artifacts beyond the stoneworks themselves survived to indicate who had built them or when they had finally abandoned these positions. the frontier journals told a different story than the academic debate suggested. Between 1750 and 1780, settlers pushing into the Appalachian interior documented experiences that aligned disturbingly well with indigenous oral traditions. These accounts, scattered across county historical societies and family archives, remained largely ignored by researchers focused on official government records and institutional sources. Isaac Hartley kept a detailed journal during his family's settlement attempts in what would become eastern Kentucky. His entries from 1762 described losing livestock under circumstances that defied normal predation patterns. 3 cows vanished from a fenced pasture overnight in June of that year, with no blood trail or signs of struggle. The fence rails had been removed and stacked neatly to one side, then replaced after the animals were taken. Hartley noted that no Cherokee or Shawnee hunting party he had encountered would bother with such careful property handling, and the sheer weight of the fence rails suggested whoever moved them possessed considerable strength. A more disturbing entry from October of 1763 described Hartley's eldest son returning from a hunting expedition with an account that left the family sleeping with loaded muskets for weeks afterward. The boy, 16 years old and experienced in mountain travel, claimed he had been tracked for several hours by something moving parallel to his position along a ridge line above. He never saw the figure clearly, only glimpses through the trees of something much taller than a normal man, moving with deliberate purpose. When he finally descended to lower elevations and entered denser forest, the presence ceased following. The boy refused to hunt alone in the high country after that incident. Similar accounts appeared in journals from Virginia and Tennessee territories. Margaret Bradshaw, a midwife who traveled extensively through frontier settlements, recorded an incident from 1774 in her personal correspondence. A family living in an isolated valley reported that their 12-year-old daughter had disappeared while gathering firewood near dusk. Search parties found no trace of the child for 3 days. On the 4th day, her body was discovered 8 miles from the homestead, placed on a rock outcropping at an elevation that required hours of difficult climbing. The positioning appeared deliberate rather than the result of an animal attack. No predator damage marked the remains, and the cause of death could not be determined. The most detailed account came from a militia officer named Benjamin Hodge, who led patrols through contested territory during the period of frontier conflicts in the 1770s. His official reports, preserved in Virginia State Archives, included an entry from August of 1777 that his superiors apparently chose not to pursue. Hodge described encountering a temporary camp at high elevation that showed signs of recent occupation. The fire pit contained bones from a deer, broken open to extract marrow. The braking force had shattered the femurs completely, something Hodge noted would require strength beyond normal human capability, or the use of heavy tools that would leave different fracture patterns. Footprints in soft soil near the camp measured considerably larger than Hodge or any of his men could produce. He estimated the individual who made them would stand between 7 and 8 feet tall, based on stride length and depth of impression in the ground. His patrol followed the tracks for approximately 2 miles before losing them on rocky terrain. Hodge concluded his report by recommending that future patrols avoid the highest elevations during summer months when these individuals appeared most active. The reports effectively ceased after 1785. Whether this reflected actual changes in encounter frequency or simply a shift in what frontier families considered worth documenting remains unclear. By the early 1800s, accounts of unusual sightings became rare enough that most attributed them to exaggeration or misidentification. The mountains kept their secrets as new generations of settlers arrived who knew nothing of what their predecessors had witnessed in the high country. The excavations between 1884 and 1891 revealed something more disturbing than unusual skeletal proportions. Physical anthropologists examining the recovered remains found evidence of systemic health collapse occurring across an entire population within a relatively compressed time frame. Dr. Blackburn's detailed bone analysis, conducted before the specimens vanished from Smithsonian storage, documented patterns consistent with severe nutritional deficiency, epidemic disease, and traumatic injury occurring simultaneously. Bone porosity in multiple specimens indicated chronic malnutrition during the final years of life. The condition affected individuals across different age ranges, suggesting widespread food scarcity rather than isolated cases of individual illness. Blackburn noted this finding with particular attention because the skeletal structure of these individuals suggested they had been physically powerful during earlier life periods. The deterioration represented a dramatic decline from what had clearly been a robust population. Lesions on several skulls and long bones showed characteristics consistent with infectious disease, though Blackburn could not identify the specific pathogen responsible. The pattern of bone involvement suggested something that spread rapidly through close contact populations. 3 specimens from the central burial chamber showed evidence of the same disease process, indicating they likely died within a similar time frame. The bone changes required months or years to develop, meaning these individuals suffered extended illness before death. More ominous were the trauma patterns. 7 skeletons displayed evidence of violent death. Fractures to skulls, ribs, and arm bones showed healing that never completed, indicating these injuries occurred at or near the time of death. The force required to produce such damage would have been substantial. 2 skulls showed depressed fractures consistent with blunt force trauma from above, as though the individuals had been struck while kneeling or prone. Defense wounds marked the forearm bones of 3 specimens, suggesting they had raised their arms to protect themselves during attack. The burial arrangement itself suggested hurried interment during a crisis period. Unlike the careful positioning evident in the older outer ring burials, the central chamber showed bodies placed with less ceremony. Some remained partially articulated, in ways suggesting they had been wrapped in organic material that subsequently decayed. Others showed signs of having been moved after initial decomposition began elsewhere, then reinterred in this location. The soil layers indicated multiple burial events occurring within a span of perhaps 5 to 10 years, concentrated around what Blackburn estimated to be 900 to 1100 CE, based on comparative burial practices from other regional sites. Artifact analysis provided additional evidence of population stress. The later burials contained fewer grave goods than earlier interments. Tools found in the outer ring chambers showed sophisticated craftsmanship, while items from the central area appeared hastily made or represented salvaged implements from earlier periods. One burial contained a stone blade that had been broken and rehafted multiple times, its edge worn nearly smooth from repeated sharpening. This suggested either shortage of suitable stone for tool making or inability to access traditional quarrying sites. Most telling was the absence of children's remains. The 17 burials documented at the railway site included no individuals under approximately 15 years of age based on skeletal development markers. Either children were buried elsewhere, which would contradict the apparent family grouping evident in the central chamber, or the population had ceased producing offspring that survived to burial age. Both possibilities pointed to a community in terminal decline. Cherokee oral traditions collected by Father Mercier included references to a great dying time when the old ones weakened and could no longer defend their high places. The accounts described this period as lasting perhaps 2 generations, during which the pale giants retreated from lower elevations and eventually disappeared entirely. The skeletal evidence supported these oral histories with uncomfortable precision, documenting not just the existence of this population, but the manner of their extinction. The final sightings came from sources considered reliable by frontier standards. Between 1790 and 1850, documented encounters with exceptionally tall individuals in remote mountain regions occurred with enough frequency to appear in official correspondence, missionary records, and travelers' journals. These accounts differed significantly from the terror-filled reports of earlier decades. Instead, they described what appeared to be remnant populations struggling to survive in increasingly isolated circumstances. A circuit preacher named Reverend Tobias Landry maintained detailed records of his travels through mountain communities intense between 1798 and 1823. His journals, preserved at the Kentucky Historical Society, included 3 separate encounters with individuals he described as being of remarkable stature and unusual appearance. The first occurred in August of 1802, near the headwaters of the Cumberland River. Landry wrote that he observed from a distance of perhaps 200 yards a family group consisting of 2 adults and what appeared to be an adolescent. They were foraging in a high meadow, gathering plants that Landry could not identify from his position. When they became aware of his presence, they retreated rapidly into dense forest cover. Landry noted their height exceeded any person he had encountered, estimating the adults stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. His second sighting, documented in June of 1814, proved more disturbing. While traveling between settlements, Landry came upon a shelter constructed from branches and bark at an elevation he estimated exceeded 4,000 feet. The structure appeared recently abandoned. Inside, he found evidence of prolonged occupation, including primitive sleeping arrangements, fire-blackened stones, and scattered animal bones. The scale of the shelter suggested occupants of unusual size. Most troubling was a grave marker constructed from stacked stones nearby. Landry noted that whatever or whoever had been buried there had been interred with great care, the stones arranged in a pattern suggesting ritual significance. Similar encounters appeared in government correspondence. A land surveyor named Nathan Pryor reported to Tennessee territorial authorities in 1819 about encountering 3 individuals of extraordinary height while mapping property boundaries in a contested mountain region. Pryor's official report described them as appearing malnourished and wearing clothing fashioned from animal hides in a style unlike any indigenous group he had encountered. They made no threatening gestures, but watched his survey team from elevated positions for several hours before disappearing. Pryor noted their presence complicated his ability to complete accurate measurements, as his crew refused to work in areas where these individuals might be observing. The most detailed late-period account came from a fur trapper named Ezekiel Drummond, whose personal journal surfaced in a West Virginia estate sale in 1937. Drummond described an extended encounter during the winter of 1843, when he sheltered in a cave system during a severe snowstorm. He discovered the cave already occupied by an elderly man and woman of exceptional height. Despite obvious physical decline, the man still stood well over 7 feet tall. They communicated through gestures, as Drummond spoke no language they understood, and they spoke no English or Cherokee. Drummond remained in the cave for 4 days while the storm continued. He noted that the couple possessed few belongings beyond basic survival tools and appeared to be suffering from inadequate nutrition. The woman showed signs of advanced illness, coughing frequently and unable to move without assistance. When the weather cleared, Drummond departed, leaving behind most of his food supplies. He returned to the location the following spring out of curiosity. The cave showed no signs of recent occupation. Outside the entrance, he found 2 graves marked with the same stacked stone pattern Reverend Landry had documented 30 years earlier. After 1850, such accounts ceased entirely. Whether the last individuals of this population finally succumbed to disease, starvation, or simply retreated beyond all contact remained unknown. The mountains fell silent on the matter, and a new generation of settlers arrived who had never heard the old stories. By 1900, the physical evidence had effectively vanished. Dr. Blackburn's transported specimens disappeared from Smithsonian records without explanation. Skeletal remains from subsequent excavations met similar fates. A mining operation in eastern Kentucky uncovered a burial site containing 5 skeletons of unusual size in 1898. The bones were reportedly sent to the University of Pennsylvania for analysis. No record of their arrival exists in university archives. A construction crew working on a rail spur near the Virginia border discovered similar remains in 1904. Local newspaper accounts described the find in detail, including measurements taken by the county coroner. The bones were supposedly transferred to State Historical Society storage. That institution has no documentation of receiving them. The pattern repeated across multiple institutions and locations. Discovery reports existed in local newspapers, county records, and personal correspondence. Transfer documentation showed specimens sent to various academic facilities for study. Yet the physical evidence never appeared in permanent collections. Archive searches conducted in later decades found gaps in accession records, missing catalog numbers, and storage locations that could not be located or had been cleared without proper documentation of contents. Professor Edmund Thornley, who had led the Yale expedition to the original railway site, attempted to publish comprehensive findings in 1901. His manuscript included detailed skeletal measurements, photographic documentation, and analysis of burial practices. The journal that initially accepted the work withdrew its publication offer without explanation. Thornley's personal papers, donated to Yale after his death in 1917, included correspondence indicating pressure from unnamed sources to abandon his research into the Appalachian burial sites. One letter from a Smithsonian administrator suggested that continued investigation would damage his academic reputation and career prospects. Margaret Sinclair faced similar obstacles when attempting to publish expanded analysis of Father Mercier's journals in 1903. Her manuscript, which correlated oral histories with archaeological findings, was rejected by 7 academic presses. Reader reports, preserved in her personal archive, cited concerns about sensationalism and lack of physical evidence to support extraordinary claims. One reviewer noted that regardless of documentation quality, the subject matter would not be taken seriously by the academic establishment. Harold Pittman's geological survey reports remained accessible in government archives, but his detailed descriptions of the stone fortifications generated no follow-up investigations. When Pittman proposed a dedicated archaeological survey of the Highland structures in 1908, his request for funding was denied without review. A colleague at the survey office later informed him privately that certain subjects were considered academically unproductive and potentially damaging to professional credibility. The suppression appeared coordinated, yet left no clear evidence of organized conspiracy. No single institution or individual could be identified as directing the pattern. Instead, evidence simply failed to survive the transition from initial discovery to permanent documentation. Specimens vanished during transfer between facilities. Publication opportunities disappeared after initial acceptance. Research funding proved impossible to secure. Academic careers suffered for those who persisted in investigating the subject. By 1920, the topic had effectively disappeared from scholarly discourse. The railway excavation site, the stone fortifications, the historical accounts, all remained in scattered records across multiple archives. But no active research continued. No new investigations were proposed. The academic community had moved on to subjects with better documentation and less controversial implications. A few researchers maintained private interest. Sinclair continued collecting historical accounts until her death in 1931. Her files, donated to the Library of Congress, contained over 200 separate references to the pale giants from sources spanning 3 centuries. The collection attracted no significant scholarly attention. It sat largely untouched in the manuscript division, cataloged but unexamined, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Modern genetic research offers tantalizing hints without providing definitive answers. Population studies conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s identified unusual genetic markers in isolated Appalachian communities that suggest prehistoric population mixing from sources not yet fully understood. These markers appear most frequently in families with documented multi-generational residence in the highest elevation regions, particularly areas corresponding to the ancient fortification sites documented by Harold Pittman. Dr. Rachel Kierstead, a geneticist at the University of Tennessee, published findings in 2004 examining mitochondrial DNA from participants in a regional health study. Her analysis revealed haplogroups that did not match expected patterns for Native American, European, or African ancestry. The markers suggested genetic contributions from a population that either predated known migration patterns into North America or represented an unidentified source group that subsequently disappeared from the genetic record. Kierstead noted that the sample size remained too small for definitive conclusions, but the anomalies warranted further investigation. That investigation never received funding. Kierstead's grant applications were consistently rejected, despite strong preliminary data. Review comments cited methodological concerns and insufficient justification for the proposed research scope. She abandoned the project in 2007 after her department chair suggested that pursuing controversial topics might jeopardize her tenure evaluation. The genetic samples remained in storage at the university, preserved but unanalyzed. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology have revealed extensive structural remains throughout the Appalachian highlands that conventional excavation never documented. A Forestry Service mapping project in 2012 accidentally discovered a complex of stone foundations beneath heavy forest cover in eastern Kentucky. The structures showed sophisticated layout patterns, suggesting planned community organization rather than random settlement. Their positioning and construction matched descriptions from the 1905 geological surveys. No archaeological excavation of the site has been authorized despite repeated proposals from research teams. Similar discoveries emerged from LiDAR data collected for environmental monitoring purposes. Elevation maps revealed geometric patterns consistent with ancient earthworks at multiple locations across Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. The scale and distribution suggested a much larger population presence than previously documented. Yet these findings generated minimal academic interest. The data exists in Forestry Service archives, available to researchers who know to request it, but effectively invisible to those unaware of its significance. The stone fortifications remain, where Pittman documented them over a century ago. Hikers occasionally encounter these structures, usually mistaking them for natural rock formations or assuming they represent forgotten homestead boundaries from the 1800s. The walls stand silent on remote ridgelines, slowly succumbing to root invasion and freeze-thaw cycles, gradually losing definition as forests reclaim the mountain heights. Local oral traditions persist in some communities. Families with deep roots in the region still tell stories about the old ones who lived in the high places, though most frame these as folklore rather than history. A few elders maintain that certain mountain areas should be avoided, that some locations remain touched by presences that preceded current memory. These warnings are rarely heeded by outsiders who lack the generational context to understand their significance. The question remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, with current evidence. Who were these people? Where did they originate? What caused their decline? Why did they choose such extreme isolation? The mountains keep their secrets, and the academic establishment shows little interest in asking questions that might prove too difficult to answer within comfortable theoretical frameworks. The pale giants remain suspended between documented history and dismissed legend, their existence supported by too much evidence to ignore, yet too controversial to investigate thoroughly. They exist in the spaces between certainty and myth, where uncomfortable truths go to be forgotten. The evidence exists in fragments scattered across institutional archives, family collections, and geological surveys that never intended to document human history. No single repository contains the complete picture. The railway excavation photographs sit in one archive, Father Mercier's journals in another, the genetic data in university storage, the LiDAR surveys in Forestry Service databases. Each piece tells part of a story that becomes visible only when examined together, yet no institutional framework exists to facilitate that synthesis. What emerges from this fractured evidence is the outline of a population that inhabited the highest Appalachian elevations for an indeterminate period, possibly centuries or longer, before disappearing sometime between 900 and 1200 CE. They were physically distinct from surrounding populations, standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, with bone structure suggesting exceptional strength. They built sophisticated stone fortifications, commanding strategic positions across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain. They lived in deliberate isolation from other groups, maintaining defensive positions that allowed observation of valley activities while remaining separate from lowland communities. Their relationship with surrounding populations appeared complex and often hostile. Indigenous oral histories describe them as taking what they needed from valleys below, including livestock and occasionally people. Frontier accounts from the 1700s document similar patterns of livestock theft and unexplained disappearances in mountain regions. Yet the later encounters from the early 1800s show a population in dramatic decline, reduced to small family groups struggling to survive in increasingly marginal territories. The cause of their extinction remains speculative. Skeletal evidence points to simultaneous pressures from disease, malnutrition, and violence during their final period. Whether these factors were related or coincidental cannot be determined from available data. Indigenous traditions suggest they simply weakened and vanished, retreating deeper into the mountains until no trace remained. The archaeological record supports a relatively rapid population collapse, occurring over perhaps 2 or 3 generations. Modern science offers limited insight. The genetic anomalies identified in isolated Appalachian communities suggest prehistoric population mixing, but the source remains unidentified. The structural remains documented through remote sensing technology confirm extensive highland occupation by a sophisticated culture, but excavation proposals consistently fail to secure funding or institutional support. The physical evidence that might answer fundamental questions about origins, culture, and ultimate fate disappeared from institutional collections within decades of discovery. What makes this mystery particularly frustrating is not the absence of evidence, but its systematic exclusion from serious scholarly consideration. The documentation exists. The oral histories span centuries and cross multiple cultures with remarkable consistency. The physical remains were examined by credentialed researchers who documented their findings thoroughly. Yet academic discourse treats the subject as fringe speculation, despite source material that would be considered compelling in other historical contexts. The Pale Giants ruled Appalachia before recorded history began, built fortifications that still stand today, and vanished, leaving only scattered bones and stone walls as evidence of their existence. They terrified the people who encountered them, dominated strategic mountain territories, and then disappeared so completely that their very existence became questionable. The mountains remember, even if academic institutions choose to forget. Somewhere in those highlands, perhaps in caves not yet discovered, or burial sites still hidden beneath forest growth, more evidence waits. Whether anyone will ever be permitted to search for it remains an open question. The truth exists in pieces, waiting for someone willing to assemble them, despite the professional costs of investigating a subject the establishment prefers to ignore. Until then, the Pale Giants remain where they have always been, suspended between history and legend, documented but dismissed. Evidence of something that challenges our understanding of who inhabited this continent and when. If the evidence you just saw ignites a rage in you, a sense of profound, historic betrayal, do not let that feeling fade. Hit like and subscribe now. We are the front line against the lies. We are tearing down the comfortable, fabricated reality that has been handed to us by the institutional gatekeepers of the past. You now carry this burden of knowledge. Share this video with every person you know who is tired of the official narrative, who is hungry for what they've been denied. The truth is not just scattered, it has been viciously buried. We will keep digging. We will expose every shard. Your action is our fuel.